Have you news of my boy Jack? Not this tide. When do you think that he'll come back? Not with this wind blowing, and this tide. Has anyone else had word of him? Not this tide. For what is sunk will hardly swim, not with this wind blowing, and this tide. Oh dear, what comfort can I find? None this tide, nor any tide. Except he did not shame his kind, not even with that wind blowing, and that tide. Then hold your head up all the more, this tide and every tide, because he was the son you bore, and gave to that wind blowing, and that tide. Hello YouTube, Film Buff 06 here, coming your way with my review of the biographical made-for-TV movie My Boy Jack, which was named after one of Rudyard Kipling's best-known poems, which he wrote in 1916. Was initially broadcast on ITV to approximately 5.7 million viewers on Remembrance Day 2007 and on PBS on the 20th of April 2008 as part of the Masterpiece Classics series. Was directed by an Irish film and television director named Brian Kirk, was partially shot at Bateman's, which is currently a National Trust property, but used to be the East Sussex home of Rudyard Kipling and his family from 1902 up until his death in 1936, and also primarily in parts of Ireland. Stars David Haig, who also helped to adapt his own 1997 stage play of the same name, Daniel Radcliffe, Carey Mulligan, and Kim Cattrall. Takes place in 1914 to 15, just around the time of the beginning of World War I, and basically chronicles the heartbreaking true story of how Rudyard Kipling himself, arguably one of the greatest storytellers and poets of all time, thanks to the likes of If, Mandalay, The Man Who Would Be King, Kim, Gunga Din, Captains Courageous, the Just So stories, and especially the Jungle Book, had to gradually come to terms with the tragic consequences of his almost fanatical right-wing and controversial support of the war at the time, which ended up unfortunately costing him the life of his only son, John, nicknamed Jack, who seemed to share almost the same passion as his father to want to enlist in the war and potentially risk his life for the sake of king and country, but had an extremely severe case of myopia, which resulted in him completely failing two medicals, and Rudyard having to pull a few strings by any means necessary in order to successfully get him enrolled the following year as a second lieutenant in the Irish Guards, which in turn ultimately resulted in Jack reportedly going missing in action just a day after his 18th birthday that September during the Battle of Lewes, in what was his first assignment, only for the Kipling family to then eventually find out the devastating truth that Jack accidentally lost his glasses, was actually gunned down during the conflict, and instantly died from his injuries. So, what are my thoughts on My Boy Jack now that I've seen it for really the first time in just over a decade since it was first broadcast? This movie, for lack of a better word, finally gave me exactly the level of perfection I was looking for so far this year. And I am dead serious when I say this, guys. Words just genuinely cannot even begin to describe how much I freaking loved every single minute of this movie, and even how much of a profound and emotional impact it left on me exactly 10 to 20 minutes after watching it. In fact, the only best way I can describe the story to this movie is that it's Saving Private Ryan meets Paths of Glory meets All Quiet on the Western Front meets King Lear, plus the fact that it almost felt like I was watching an actual stage play come to life on the small screen. First off, I know Brian Kirk went on after this to direct episodes of The Tudors and Boardwalk Empire, but who would have honestly thought this guy would also later go on to direct a few episodes of one of the greatest fantasy TV shows on at the moment, Game of Thrones? Because the way he directs this movie, in pretty much the exact same way I would imagine someone like Steven Spielberg directing it, is absolutely outstanding. Speaking of which, the Schindler's List-esque score by Adrian Johnston is absolutely fucking incredibly beautiful and haunting, and always manages to bring a few tears to your eyes every time you listen to it. Also, for a movie that, in my honest opinion anyway, should have indeed been released in cinemas, but was instead solely made just for television, likewise with the 1984 version of A Christmas Carol with George C. Scott. The cinematography here by Bill Odd looks almost impressively cinematic in scope, and really makes you feel like you are in the thick of the action, especially when it comes to the way the war scenes are edited and shot, as well as how skillfully it manages to contrast the lovely, cosy and homely atmosphere of the Kipling house with the much more dark and cold and treacherous conditions of trench life that the British soldiers who fought in the war had to endure on the battlefield. The acting from everyone involved, from the four leads to even the relatively minor supporting roles from the likes of Martin McCann as Beau and Julian Wadham as King George V, is A+ fan-freaking-tastic across the board. Carey Mulligan is great as Elsie Kipling, or Bird as she is otherwise known throughout the film, in one of her earliest screen roles, other than her role as Sally Sparrow in the Doctor Who episode Blink around that same year, before her Oscar-nominated role in An Education virtually catapulted her into the international mainstream and made her become the bona fide superstar we know her as today. Now, a lot of people have criticised Kim Cattrall's performance in this movie as Caroline Kipling as being a little bit forced and out of place. But for my money, she brilliantly sheds her iconic image as Samantha Jones in Sex and the City, with her much more restrained and dignified performance here of a woman who absolutely adores her son unconditionally and still manages to remain incredibly supportive and devoted to her husband Rudyard, even despite their mutual disagreements with one another over whether or not he is doing the right thing, by arranging to send their own son off to fight in this inevitably terrible war. Daniel Radcliffe gives an amazing performance as John Jack Kipling in what is altogether a 110% completely different role from that of Harry Potter. I mean, he is severely myopic, he swears, he smokes, he drinks, he sports a Hitler-style haircut, he gets to command and boss around a relatively small army of soldiers on the battlefield. He gets to carry a gun into battle with him as opposed to a magic wand. And he actually gets to have a tragic death scene at the end of the film, which when it happens completely devastates you, hits you like a truck, immediately puts you in the shoes of the Kipling family, and just emotionally sticks and resonates with you, especially if you've ever lost a loved one in similar circumstances. You can also clearly tell from watching Daniel's performance in this movie that he wanted to completely distance himself from the iconic boy wizard image that pretty much everyone, even including yours truly, had of him at the time as Harry Potter, and thus proved to the world that he wasn't a child actor anymore, that he was growing up, in other words, and thus wanted to be taken much more seriously as an actor in his own right, and that he wasn't afraid to flex his acting muscles and tackle much more risque and meatier roles than people usually expected of him at the time, a la his early stage turn as a semi-naked farmhand in Equus. Plus the chemistry between him and David Haig is amazing and makes you completely buy the father-son relationship that provides the overall heart of the movie between John and his father Rudyard, even despite the fact that it obviously ends rather tragically, purely because it feels so natural, so genuine, so sincere, and so believable that you'd almost mistake the two as being actual father and son. And speaking of David Haig, not only does he do such a flawless job translating essentially his own pet project from the stage to the small screen, not only does he show extreme passion and dedication to his role and to doing the subject matter itself justice the best that he possibly could, not only do you get the sense that this was a role that he was probably pretty much damn born to play, but also his beyond phenomenal performance as Rudyard Kipling is the one that completely dominates every single freaking frame of this entire movie from start to finish. And why the hell BAFTA did not nominate this man for Best Leading Actor for this performance is and always will be completely beyond me. He completely transforms into this icon of English literature / poetry that was Rudyard Kipling. And he just gives one of these remarkable performances, like Kenneth Branagh as Laurence Olivier in My Week with Marilyn, or Willem Dafoe as Max Schreck in Shadow of the Vampire, or Michael Fassbender as Steve Jobs, or Ben Kingsley as Gandhi, or Meryl Streep, to a certain extent, as Margaret Thatcher in The Iron Lady, or Helen Mirren as the Queen, or Colin Firth as King George VI in The King's Speech, or James Franco as Tommy Wiseau in The Disaster Artist, or Frank Langella as Richard Nixon in Frost Nixon, or Eddie Redmayne as Stephen Hawking in The Theory of Everything, or Gary Oldman as Winston Churchill in Darkest Hour, or heck even Daniel Day-Lewis as Abraham Lincoln, where you just completely forget that you're watching a performance of a particular historical figure and actually genuinely believe that you're watching that particular historical figure themselves come to life in front of your eyes on the screen. Not only that, but I also really adore his extremely historically accurate portrayal of Kipling in this movie as almost a Shakespearean character, as a man who is incredibly devoted to his family and at this moment in time is at the absolute pinnacle of his worldwide fame and success as a children's writer and one of the greatest poets of his generation. But at the same time, he has this extremely controversial and rather radical political ideology that on the surface may make him seem to come across as a little bit of a biased dick, especially in the face of his particular obsessive hatred towards Germany under Kaiser Wilhelm II, that actually was pretty much part of what kick-started the First World War in the first place. But again, at the same time, he strongly believes in what he initially thinks is a just and noble cause for the future of the British Empire before his beloved son's inevitable demise during what was then known as the Great War to End All Wars, almost completely changes his worldview, and he becomes tremendously racked with guilt and shame at the end because he realizes deep down that he somehow disappointed his own son and willingly sent him to his death by somehow pressurizing him and at the same time allowing him to continue pursuing his dream of joining the military and ultimately giving his own life, not just for king and country, but also to get away from his own family, and in particular to escape the shadow of having a celebrity father. I also really love the beautiful, poignant, and rather tear-jerking way the film ended as it did, with Rudyard reciting his famous poem, My Boy Jack, to King George V, especially in light of the tragic deaths around this time of not just one, but both of their young sons, coincidentally named John. One John who was killed while fighting in the trenches, while the other John died as a result of his epilepsy. But if there is one slight and admittedly petty little nitpick rather than a legit criticism that I have with it that doesn't exactly detract or take away from my overall love towards this movie, and I honestly don't know for sure if it features as a deleted or extended scene on the DVD, it's that I would personally love to have seen on the screen a little bit more of the extended ending or the third act from the original stage play that takes place just nearly 2 decades after Jack's death, and also to have particularly seen Rudyard Kipling's character arc come full circle, albeit in obviously tragic and ironic circumstances, where he pretty much becomes a victim of his own success, as he quite rightly tries to warn everyone of the impending dangers of Nazism, as well as the looming threat around this time of a much more volatile, dangerous and cataclysmic war that was just around the corner and was just waiting to happen. But as we all know, for somewhat understandable and harshly realistic reasons, his warnings obviously fall on deaf ears because nobody wants to listen to or buy any more of his incendiary bullshit because of how much of a massive chain reaction his rhetoric had caused on the world stage at that point, as well as the fact that it not only added fuel to the political fire, not only effectively became part of the huge smoking gun that helped to precipitate the horrendous inferno of disaster that was World War I, not only led to the pointless and futile deaths of hundreds of thousands of young British soldiers fighting in the trenches for just over half a decade, but also inadvertently sowed the seeds of political discourse and almost worldwide financial ruin that ultimately paved the way for Hitler and the Third Reich to meteorically rise to power in Germany and thus begin World War II. In conclusion, words still cannot begin to express or even describe how simultaneously brought to tears and completely blown the fuck away emotionally I was by this movie. It made me really think about the brutality, the harshness, and the senselessness of war itself, as well as specifically what the families of all the soldiers who lost their lives during the war had to suffer through during this really dark, traumatic and sad time in our modern history. It has a beautifully well told, tragic and heartbreaking story that is greatly bolstered by fantastic performances across the board, superb direction, flawless writing, amazing cinematography, and a beautiful, haunting score. You instantly know you've experienced something truly great and special when it leaves you virtually speechless for 10 to 20 minutes after you watch it, and gets such an intense, incredibly emotional reaction out of you, where you constantly find yourself trying to fight back the little lumps that form in your throat, as well as fight back all the tears. I cannot fucking recommend this movie highly enough to anybody who is a Daniel Radcliffe fan or remember reading any of Rudyard Kipling's amazing literary works, such as the Just So stories and the Jungle Book when they were kids, or really has a deep fascination with the subject matter itself, and or just wants to sit back, relax, and enjoy a surprisingly well-made TV movie for an hour and a half's worth of their time. And with all of that said, my overall rating for My Boy Jack is of course going to be an awesome-tacular and perfect 10 out of 10. Now, please feel free to leave a comment in the section below, and please let me know your individual thoughts on My Boy Jack, as well as let me know what your personal favourite Rudyard Kipling book, poem, or adaptation is. Plus, feel free to subscribe to my channel as always, as well as go to my channel page and click on the little bell so that you get all of the notifications and updates on my channel via email. And also, if you haven't already, please don't forget to join my Facebook group page as well as follow me on Twitter and Instagram. And until my next video, in which I am most definitely going to pay a bit of a belated tribute to Professor Stephen Hawking by reviewing the 2013 biographical documentary film named after him. Do take care, everyone, and goodbye, bell, so that you get all of the notifications and updates on my channel via email. And also, if you haven't already, please don't forget to join my Facebook group page, as well as follow me on Twitter and Instagram. And until my next video, in which I am most definitely going to pay a bit of a belated tribute to Professor Stephen Hawking by reviewing the 2013 biographical documentary film named after him. Do take care, everyone, and goodbye.